Very much everyone for coming. I'm Chris. I'm one of the three musketeers that runs the GTA PHP users group. So this month we have Michael, who's going to be doing a talk about kind of the intersection of UI and UX and harnessing the power of user narratives and trying to get you guys to think more about how the applications you built look and how they get used instead of just how they actually work under the hood.
Thanks for inviting me, Chris. So my name's Michael Keara, twittering occasionally as user advocate. I have a small company in town here for usability consulting, UX consulting, the user advocate group, just a few of us. And we mostly do projects in terms of websites and so on. We do projects with Drupal, which is apparently the equivalent to Ruby for Rails. So it's Drupal on PHP, I guess you could call it, right? The thing that I want to talk about tonight is basically based on a Drupal project that was done last year, and it's a kind of a case study I'll refer to. But a lot of it is about the technical stuff that I wanted to sort of lift up the hood and take a look at some of the impacts there. So anyway, what do? I'm a user interface systems architect, which means that I listen to users primarily, because I really do think that the secret to good usability design is actually just observing and listening as a form of that, and just trying to hear what people are actually saying, listening, reading between the lines, whatever. That's a really important part of it. And then the other part that I do is build stuff. So I try to take the things that I hear and understand and derive from this listening into something which can be built and hopefully will work properly for them and does the job for them. So I like to cross that boundary. So the case study that I want to talk about is for online registration. It was with the Royal Conservatory of Music. It was a project I did for a client, My Planet Digital. They're a company in town here. So the objective that I want to get across tonight is to look at the impact of the technical implementation on the user experience. I'm not going to say this is like broad and comprehensive and it's everything about the application or about this particular project. It's one particular piece. It's the piece that I call user narrative. So I'll be defining what I mean by that and then sort of looking at that very particular slice. So there's two spaces we want to connect. The space where the developers have their mindset and when they're thinking about things, as you know. Actually, I meant to ask you, how many people here are developers? Okay, how many's not a developer? Oh, okay, so there's some. Okay, thanks. And how many people here have designed user interfaces, user experiences? Okay, great.
Designed really poorly.
Okay, how many people care about user experience? Oh, thank you. Great. So there's the other space. This is a picture I just used to represent a happy place for users. So obviously they're not on computers, maybe that's why they're happy. But the idea is metaphorically, they're in a nice blissful place, it's warm, it's sunny, and everything's going well with the application. So that's where I'd like users to be. And so the question is, when I'm sitting here thinking about all these things, can I really, construct something that's like that for users? Well, a lot of that, of course, has to do with the listening part, and that's where it all starts. So so what I want to do is basically present two keys to these doorways for the purposes of this presentation, this discussion. The first key is the technical factors that we'll want to consider. So I said it was about user narratives, and that implies words and is actually about words. So I'm really concerned about the words that are on the screen for the user interface. So that's the first thing I want to consider. And then how they get organized. That's a really important part as well, and I'll tell you why later. And also the degree to which they're organized or not. What is the impact for UX designers? And my hypothesis here is that if it's not done right, you actually exclude UX designers systematically. So I'll show what I mean by that. And I also want to present an inclusive alternative. Can everybody see okay? Do you want me to move this, or you're all right? Let's improve that here. All right. And then the other one is the UX factors. So something which I always refer to, because I think it's really important, is role-oriented UX design. I'll explain what I mean by that. And also something which is, I don't come across this idea very much, so I guess I'm kind of championing the idea of idioms, language beyond language. And then factoring in this idea of real-life narratives, what's actually really happening in the user's life, and what happens when they actually get to the application, and how do those two things connect or not connect. And so that's basically, when we put those two ideas together, roles and idioms, that's what I'm referring to as user narratives. I'll explain all of this in the presentation. Just a little bit of background, just sort of basics on the UX stuff, just to go over it. I don't want to make too many assumptions. So my first thing is I want to define usability. For me, usability is the lack of suffering on the part of users. I really like this. This was a sculpture, a piece of art that I found down at Harbourfront. And it's barbed wire dancing shoes. Right? That's, to me, the definition of non-usable stuff. So we want to go the other way. We want to make it usable, comfortable, I should say. Here's one that's, I'm going to challenge you a bit, maybe. Maybe you already go there, here, but my point is, the reason why I use this as a symbol is because it represents this idea. Functionality has no meaning whatsoever without a usage context. What I mean by that is, if you consider this thing and how it gets to be meaningful, is you place it someplace, you put it someplace, and it's there for a reason. All it is there for is to point to everything around it. In other words, its usage context. That is its function, right? So I find those things fascinating because there's always a narrative, always a story behind those things. Someone's put those things just behind a truck to sort of warn cars not to go too near it. For some reason, that truck needs a warning, others don't. Or it's obviously, used on construction sites. Don't go here, there's a big hole in the sidewalk, you'll fall down. But sometimes people put it in really interesting places as well. That just, there's a leaking roof or something, so there's buckets on the floor which you can see, but they put these things around the buckets to make you see them more or something. But there's always a story behind the way those things are used. But really, they have no meaning outside of all those usage contexts. And I think the same thing applies to code, to what we build as code. It really doesn't have any meaning until we consider the usage context. So that's what I'm going to be talking about as well. So when I show one of those things on the screen, it's because I'm talking about the usage context. It's a little reminder to think about the usage context. And then my Swiss Army knife has two blades, these two questions. Who is the user? What are their tasks? That's what I always begin with when I do usability stuff. I always start with that. And usually the entire project consists of answering those two questions. And it's amazing how hard they can be to answer as well. But the other one that's behind that is the context of the business objectives. Those can only really be answered in real terms within that kind of context. What is the business of all this? What is the purpose, the business purpose of the application? So the detail about this case study, it was used in 2 different countries. Guess which ones? That's right. So the Royal Conservatory of Music has a partner with the Carnegie Hall people, and they have this thing called the Achievement Program. It's basically a system of music exams. Royal Conservatory is known around the world, of course, for their education and their extremely great musical program, and a lot of it gets down to the exams. So Carnegie Hall has basically licensed it, and they're doing the same thing in the States. So we're kind of leading the way for the North America there. So there were 2 websites built for the corresponding countries, and then that means that there's 2 usage contexts, and so that's what we're going to be looking at. So the actual application has this, this website has this place where you register for exams, and it's really important because this is how they make their money. Like, it's an extremely important part of their business. Obviously, it has to be easy. The registration has to be easy. It wasn't. That's why they had it redone. That's why they hired me to help with that. And there's also different kinds of users. I'll tell you what they are. There's basically the students, their parents, and their teachers. So 3 different kinds of users are coming into this application to register for exams. So we did some testing. It's not pretty. This is me. It's just a very raw PHP prototype. I just wanted to get things in there that were interactive and sort of make sure that we had all the right sort of pieces in place before we did anything like graphic design or anything. So that's all that is, just, you know, from the ground up kind of PHP prototype. But it basically has all the main pieces in there. This is what it ended up looking like in the final application. So basically they click on this big button, they come to basically user profile, they can declare themselves as being a student or a parent or a teacher. It's checkboxes, they can be all of those things. And as they do that, so you can see there's different ways in. You can register as any one of those types of people. And as they do that, it adds tabs onto the profile to represent, you know, your stuff for your studentness, your parentness, and your teacherness. So they're different tab extensions. Then you end up in this wizard to do the actual registration itself. The wizard, this is the important part, the wizard is actually the same code for each one of those entry points. And that's where the challenge starts to happen in terms of, you know, you want to be concise with the amount of code you write, but you also kind of have to be able to cater to each one of those kind of mindsets. So that's the challenge. Ultimately, you pick out the course you want to be tested on, you pick a date, and then you basically pay for that. That's really what the application was about at that end. So we did some testing of that. Well, actually, yeah, we did testing of the prototype. We also did testing of the final piece as well that I just showed you. What did we learn? Structural things like, you know, where pieces, you know, components should be in the sequence and so on. But really the thing I want to go into is the language stuff that we picked up. They were really both important to the actual workflow of the application itself. So the language stuff, I don't know if you're going to be able to hear it, but I'll give it a try. But this is what, there was one person in particular that came out with, I couldn't have paid him to do better than this, but the feedback he gave me was so clear for the point that I'm trying to make here. We'll see if you can hear it.
I still don't know what a founding school is, so I'll leave it blank. I don't know what that means. So I don't know if that's the school I teach at as the teacher, or if that's the school that the student goes to. Yeah, well, because I don't know what an assessment is, in a way. I mean, I'm assuming it's, like, I sort of can work it out, but I wouldn't have, like, schedule an exam. I mean, here we're trying to book an exam, and really everything is worded around assessment. I would not think exam for an assessment, but if there was a log as to what all of these things meant, and maybe a glossary of terms so we could find out what founding school meant.
So, like most users, he's looking for a workaround and he's saying, maybe give me a glossary of terms so I can understand what all this means. That to me is someone wearing barbed wire shoes. Mixed up by the words, confused by the words. And the reason why he's confused by that is because in the States, they don't use the word exams, they use the word assessment. Right off the bat, we've got a problem. So none of the interface made sense to him from that point of view. And then the other quote, which I also like.
Summarize again, like what your overall impression is.
I think the language needs to change for each type of person. If I'm a teacher, I would want to see the words that say register my student.
Yeah.
The language, since I'm a teacher, and the language was written for the student, and not for the teacher. Because I'm trying to do something as a teacher, and all of the words are guiding students rather than teachers.
Okay.
So I don't know if it makes sense to have 3 different types of language that click up when you see student, parent, teacher. Because there are 3 different positions.
Teacher, he's saying, I'd like to have different language for each type of person. Good idea, because that's what we did. So type of user was important. Now what that boils down to is that there is something beyond just language like English or French. There is this thing, idiom, assessment versus exam. And then there's this idea of role, who am I, and please talk to me, you know, in a way that makes sense to me as a student, as a parent, or as a teacher. So role is really important. So idioms, that's the flavor of the language, as it were. And here's the problem. If the term is unfamiliar, like you didn't know what an assessment was, that's uncomfortable. That's barbed wire shoes. If you use generic terms to try and catch everything all at once, that's also awkward as well. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't really fit. But if you have the right familiar terms to that person, that's where you find comfort. And by my definition, that's where you find usability. So roles, I just want to expand on that a bit. Why do I talk about roles? Because life is roles. Here's some random ones pulled. A cook at breakfast, a dog walker, a commuter, emailer, music student, exam candidate. And the point about that is that each one of these roles, when we take them on, requires some tools of some kind. So if I'm making breakfast, I need a stove and a toaster. If I'm walking a dog, I need a leash and a dog. If I'm a commuter, I might need a subway train, etc., etc. So your role is very much associated and tied to the tools that you're using to carry out that role. So in terms of user interface design that's role-oriented, the point is to simply try and get the right tools onto the screen at the right time for the user doing that particular task. It's as simple as that. Because if you don't do that, you're either missing something or you're cluttering the screen. And that's where it gets confusing. So just to look at that a little bit, there's also another advantage in terms of getting this into implementation sort of terms. And that's why I have this little path. I like to trace this path from that front end, that set of tools that appears on the screen, into the back. So we have real people who are users. We take this one. She's a music teacher. She handles exam registration. She's been doing this for a while, so she also does the testing, like she evaluates. She's the examiner. And she's been doing that for so long, they've actually made her exam center rep. So there's different things that she would do that are related, but they're different. So they require different tools because she has different tasks. Under exam registration, she'll have to do things like find her students, organize them, pick one out, and then select the exam that they're going to be taking, and then book that exam, and then do some payment. So those are the tasks just to handle exam registration. And they would be quite different tasks if she was doing, testing, like examining the student itself or putting the marks in and so on. There would be different tasks, different tools would be required. So by associating the idea of a role, like what am I doing? What is the user doing? Who is the user? What are their tasks? With what I call screenware, the stuff, the tools that appear on the screen, I call it screenware. You can see actually there's a very natural connection to these levels, to the information architecture, how you organize the data, right? And ultimately, how you store it, and of course, how you fish it back out through queries and so on. So this is just basically the visual query builder used in Drupal. It's called Views. That's what's behind there. So it connects. All those things connect. What's on the screen as a tool set can influence how you actually might design the system at the back end. And that's why I find it really useful as well. So yeah, so it affects the layout, it affects the information architecture, your queries, and ultimately the data structures can be affected as well. So I like that. I mean, usability people often use this term called personas, this concept of personas, which is, try and imagine this person as being real and give them a name and, imagine what they had for breakfast and so on. I don't find that terribly useful, to be honest. It's absolutely a staple for most usability people because they always have to think in terms of personas. But because roles actually allow me to do some serious, real design work that affects the entire structure of the system, I find that infinitely more useful. So, user narratives. So I want to connect all the dots with strings. So, here's our problem, the problem we need to solve. In one country, we register for exams. examinations. In another country, register for assessments. There's an aspect to that in terms of the roles. Each role has an associated mindset as well. As they're doing a certain task, they're going to be thinking certain things in certain terms, certain ways. So just in very, very top level, the student is going to say, register me. The parent is going to say, register my child. The teacher will say, register my students. Very, very simple, right? But they're important, and that's what we were hearing from the user. They didn't make sense. Looking at it sort of metaphorically then, in terms of what narratives are, if life is a series of roles, then and roles are related to mindsets, the mindsets are constantly shifting, and that makes them, metaphorically speaking, bumpy, not flat. Things are always changing. The rules are changing. That's why it's hard as developers to actually capture all these things, because often we can't see what the changes are going to be. We need inputs. We need guidance around that. But that's what's really happening. People, real users, are really changing their mind all the time. And the thing about roles too, which is different from personas, is, I'll just finish this, is that they change all the time. One user with a fixed persona can change their role, can change their mindset in an instant because they've decided to do something else.
Are you referring to the mindset about their role, what they're trying to achieve?
They're task objectives. So in other words, they've got in their head a goal. I want to do X, right? Remember we did there were check boxes we had on that profile, and so I could be a teacher, I could be a student, and I could be a parent of a student. I might actually flip across all of those things on one busy evening and say, okay, I'm going to register me, I'm going to register my child, and all my students. So theoretically it could happen. That's why we built it that way. So that's a kind of changing, sort of changeability that could happen. And that's even just within one general task objective, which is to register for exams.
I could be looking for data for myself or for a friend.
Yeah, exactly. Then you could go, and what's on TV. I mean, it could be anywhere. It could come from anywhere. Yeah? So that's why a bumpy line is a good, simple representation of that. So applications try to anticipate those mindsets and try to. I mean, that's what we try to do as developers and designers. We want to try and make sure that those things are kind of equipped for that user to help them do those things and adapt to those mindsets. But if we don't have the right information as we design and build, you end up with this big conflict and people just like, I don't know what this means. And that's a problem. And a role-oriented approach would be more harmonious. It would fit into the user's life because we have data, we have information about what that life is at that moment. So there's a bit of a problem, especially with the Drupal world. I don't know about what you guys, what your background is in terms of the use of this word, but in Drupal, roles is used to define sets of permissions. And I think that it's really unfortunate because it's such a great word, and that's such a horrible way to define it because it's not the same thing. Quite simply, permission sets don't change for any given session, for any login session. It's fixed. And it's set by an administrator, right? But roles, as I said, are constantly changing. So if you build a system around something fixed, like permissions, you simply don't have the leverage to adapt to that reality of somebody changing their mind and saying, I'm done doing that, now I want to do that. Permissions won't give you anything about that. They'll simply tell you they should or shouldn't be able to see this or that control or this interface. It's not nearly as articulate. And then the other thing is, can we actually support the notion of idioms? Drupal, again, does not do that. It only supports language. I'll go into that in a bit. So, string theory. Everybody here anybody not know what a string is? Okay. This is a string. So you all recognize this string, right? And notice it's got a comma. The real one has a comma. A string is a set of characters bounded by quotes. And that's what you see on the screen in the interface. The words appear on the interface. Internally, you know them as strings. But I just want to rethink about strings. if you think of them actually semantically and think of them in terms of what do they mean, in terms of meanings, they tend to be clustered because they're really about thoughts. So if you're in a meeting like this, we might be using certain kinds of words, like code, like PHP, like development, and so on. But if you went to a different meetup tonight, and it's about finding a date, whole different cluster of words will be sort of localized around that subject. So it's very much related to subject. So I metaphorically like the idea of these graphs, sort of semi-chaotic kind of clusters, because that's how I would think of strings in real world terms. So they're grouped together. I like these little islands. And in Drupal, they don't look like that. They look like that. So as a UX designer, I'm going to change hats. I'll be a UX designer for a minute. As a UX designer, that is much more difficult for me to deal with. Because if I want to change what the words are saying on a particular screen at a particular time, I don't really know necessarily where to find those string definitions. And that's a problem. It makes it impractical for me to think about tuning the words for something like roles, let alone idioms, right? Because they're basically randomly distributed in the code. So just for those of you who don't know much about strings, we can just go into it, but for others it's going to be a bit repetitive, but I'll just go over it anyway. So there's two kinds of strings. The strings that the user sees on the screen, and then the strings that are used internally in the code. And what I mean by that is, here, this is an internal string. It's just the name of a piece of data, basically. And this is what the user would see on the screen. So those words, log entry, will be stuck in the piece of memory that is referred to by that name, that unfortunately is called name, by that string label. So here it is in the code itself. It's an array, and there's the assignment of that value to that piece of storage. And there's a few of them. The ones in red are all internal. And the ones in blue, if you can see that, they're all external user-facing strings. The thing about those internal strings is they shouldn't change, because if you change those things, the code breaks. If you change it, you have to do that on purpose. It's because you're actually changing the way the code works, the logic of the code. But on the other hand, the ones on the outside, yeah, that's entirely the point. We do want to change those because that's the shoe we're trying to make fit. It has to be flexible. And so the word string applies really well to those because it's flexible. But I, in a way, would refer to those things as nails because they have to be as hard as nails. They're knocked into place. They're holding the logic of the system together. You don't want to mess around with those. The problem is, logically, they're all nails. They're all in the code. That's why it's a problem for UX designers, right? Because to change them, I have to say, please, developer, can you change that, right? And that's where it becomes impractical. So they're all in there. Now, in the case of Drupal, it's not a complete disaster, and Drupal is a global, open source system, and it's succeeded partly because of this, the T function, which basically allows you to translate the words in these strings, captured in these quotes, within this function, to different languages. But it doesn't allow you to be able to do nuances of those languages, like idioms. You've nailed them into place. So in terms of language, the T function works perfectly well for this. So my examination can be translated into any number of, actual main languages. Great. But it can't do this. It can't deal with the examination versus assessment problem. It just can't.
Drupal doesn't have British English option.
I don't know what the latest flavor is. There's always discussion about that. But there may still be that would be another big language decision. The thing about idioms is that just a lot of things do tend to come in clusters. So for example, not only roles, but you could actually look at entire market segments, vertical market segments, and say, this is for, land surveyors. This is for lawyers, this is for teachers. And they might all have different words at a certain point. And there's no practical way of doing that with this. There are, things like, there is one module that allows you to sort of change certain strings individually. But again, it's not practical, it's not systematic. And then the other dimension is the actual, the roles themselves. So, my exams, my kids' exams, my students' exams, that's yet another range of impossible sort of articulation or specificness that you can't get with a T function. So, why did this happen? Well, we knew, Drupal community knew that it had to translate into different languages, so that's that. But really, a lot of it is because it's convenient. There is an element of that, all I have to do is, put it in here, it's done. I can forget about it. So that says embedded strings. So embedded strings, to a degree, are convenient. At least that's the mindset of a lot of people. But I think that's a similar mindset to embedded styles, as opposed to CSS, and embedded script, right? To me, I don't see a difference. They're all convenient things, and we know those other two. No serious developer would build stuff like that now. I'm basically saying the same applies to strings. So if we want to go beyond that, we need an alternative approach. So an alternative approach that I built is a string manager class. This is the Drupal bit. This is almost the entire Drupal module right here. It's basically just a wrapper around this. There's a class underneath that. And I pass a few parameters in on the constructor and off to the races. So we basically use the wrapper like this. We build this object, an SM, a string manager, and we specify which cluster of strings we want. So this is a kind of a file directory, basically. It's a module file directory, and this is a kind of a set of strings that we can group together. So in this case, I just call it common because they're commonly used throughout the system. But you might have one for forms. You might have one for menus. You can divide it whatever way you want. It's all about how you organize your resources. So then what we do with this mechanism, we then have to extract those strings from the code, which means we basically replace this bit with what I would call a semantic key. So the truth is that the T function does actually refer to a database table where those strings are kept. But these long strings, and sometimes they're very long, are actually the keys to that database table. I don't find that very practical or very pleasant to look at, to be honest. This makes more sense to me, to use a semantic key where I can indicate, how is this string being used, basically. It's a label. What is it being used for exactly? It's a label for a blog. And that tells me something as a developer and as a person writing the string definitions themselves. So it links the internal to the external string, internal code to the external string, and it does it through simple arrays. So we've got a set of these semantic keys, and we've got whatever we want to assign to them. And all that is externalized now in a separate file. And that's what the string manager class does. It basically goes and fetches that file when you want it. Another extra piece that I pointed as well is we've got a variable here for role. So that would be set, for example, when you go across the different tabs. My assessments, my students, or my children, whatever, my family. So that would internally set a variable here. It could just be a string, obviously. And that gets appended so you can actually then have nuances of that basic string definition. So blog entry, student's blog entry, teacher's journal, could be whatever you want. It's external from the code. You don't have to risk breaking code just to fine-tune the strings. So, in this case, what we've got is all of those dimensions that we were after are basically now reachable. We can now specify which particular string do we need to use right now for this user. So what does that mean in the end? So building user narratives with these roles and idioms is really about organizing the strings. And I just want to repeat that. When they're organized, it means that as UX designers, they're trying to shape, and get that narrative to fit the life of the user as we imagine it to be. It means we now have a systematic way of going and getting those strings and articulating for that particular use case, that usage context. It's an organization problem. So in Drupal, you have core and contributed modules, and we want to connect it to these clusters of strings. And we do it through an adapter module. It's a custom module connecting to the module that I built, the user narratives module, which contains this string manager class. And that's basically the arrangement that's required. And then those things out there are basically files. In this case, you'd have one install would have sets of files for the, say, Canadian version, and then different install for American version would have a different set of files, so you can swap the files in. By the way, I used to do work with commercial desktop software, and that's clearly how we used to do it. We used to have resource files for strings like that, and very easy to manage, very easy to farm out to the people that were specialists in those areas, such as translators. And so it doesn't look like much in the end, but really what's happened now is that we're now able to make that shoe a bit more comfortable. So in this case, as a student, as a teacher, it says add a new student to your list. As a parent, it says add a new family member. It's not rocket science, but that's what comfort is about. It's about these nuances where, it doesn't take much of a pebble in your shoe to be uncomfortable to make an entire user experience go bad. And we're just getting rid of the pebbles. That's all this really means. So that's ultimately the effect that comes out of it. And that is it. I'll leave it at that.